Welcome to another edition of Carnivore Radio. I'm your host, Jeff Sherman, along with Dr. Eric Lotkin. And a lot, maybe not in quantity, but in depth. We have a lot to talk about in today's show. One thing that actually more than scared me is and others, is the potential for miscalculations and us getting involved in a hot nuclear war with Russia. And what's interesting, at least from my perspective, is during other times, like in Afghanistan, even though I'm talking when Russia was involved in Afghanistan and we helped the Mujahideen, I was just a kid, but I wasn't concerned. I was just not that, because we were indirectly going against the Soviet Union. But because you have numbnuts and the Valley Girl, and basically even in the military, it's all woke and affirmative action candidates. I got no faith that these people would know what to do. It's not exactly JFK.
No, it isn't JFK. It's certainly not the Cuban Missile Crisis. We don't have anywhere near the capability that we did at that point.
Oh yeah,
I
let
mean,
me just
fortunately,
reiterate that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had a clear advantage. We had the position of strength in terms of leveraging the Soviet Union. We're nowhere near that. The leadership in the military is more focused on lesbian studies. I think and also having the Valley Girl as our VP, Biden weekend at Bernie's as our president, it doesn't instill a lot of confidence in me that strategic that the strategic thought process will be something relating back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, or even Nixon during the '73 Yom Kippur War, unnoted in history, but almost as critical as the Cuban Missile Crisis. But your thoughts? You share the same concerns?
yeah, I'm definitely concerned about this escalating. However, what we saw over the last 48 hours was actually a remarkable amount of restraint. People actually looked into what happened. And of course, for any listeners that have been living under a rock, we're referring to missiles hitting Poland, which, of course, as a member of NATO, an attack on one is an attack on all, and it would
Yes.
draw all of Europe and us into a protracted war. Fortunately, people actually did take a step back. They took a breath. They are now pretty well convinced that it wasn't Russian missiles that hit Poland. It was a misfire from Ukraine's missile defense system. So everybody went, okay, let's get the facts first, which thank God, because
Thank God.
Lord knows these people are short on facts. But
Yeah, but also let me just interject something. I believe that that also just the civilian population, the regular Joe and Jane in the streets in America, given the dumbing down of America, doesn't understand. I don't think the true ramifications of a nuclear conflict is. They're more worried about TikTok.
well, given some of the surveys that have been done, I mean, the knowledge of the American people about how our own government works has been falling by the wayside. I mean, I've seen numerous man on the street interviews where they go out with a question about how democracy works, how the government works, and the younger generation has no idea what
Zero.
goes on. So I don't think most of them understand what our NATO obligations are, which is also scary because again, all of a sudden we can be drawn into a war and we've got an entire generation of people that don't understand why. But again,
Do you give and certainly you don't have to, my concerns about, yes, okay, this was and I'm very happy because I have to be truly honest. I kind of was a little scared about this and kind of shut off the news yesterday after I heard about this. Usually I'm always fixated on it, especially before our broadcast or our recorded session here or on podcast. But I'm very happy that there was some restraint, some introspection. But are you still concerned that given our military, there's no qualification based promotion or positioning? It does concern me.
It is an ongoing concern. Putin has stated that he would not hesitate to use nuclear weapons. I don't think it's a danger to, that we're going to see the nukes flying here. It's more likely to be a nuclear bomb used on, Ukrainian soil. But, and this is, the high point in all of this is there are people in Russia who seem to be ready to step in if Putin does cross that line. Because remember, a nuclear bomb, unlike a missile, you're basic in a case like this isn't Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We're not flying the bomb over enemy territory and our troops aren't anywhere there. The Russian troops are right there. This is their neighbor. So there's no way to use a nuclear bomb without the radiation affecting Russia, affecting the Russian troops. And there do seem to be people in at the Kremlin who are ready. That's pretty much, the line in the sand. If Putin tries to do that, I think somebody's going to put a bullet in his head.
Well, let's talk about the bullet in the head because isn't he? I'm not so sure that's not going to happen anyway. From what I'm gathering, what I've researched is he's not doing well in Ukraine, and he's got a lot of unrest. He's got a huge number of military losses in man and material in particular, like his jet force, his air force. Um, everyone, all leaders, they're buoyed by good things happening, and they're taken down. Russia, look what happened. 30 years ago in Russia. Is I think it's a potential reality of him being taken out, which I think would be a very good thing for the world.
Well, that depends on who takes him out. But realistically, I mean, Afghanistan in the 1980s, people referred to it as Russia's Vietnam.
Hmm.
And I think that description fits Ukraine very well. This is Putin's Vietnam. He got in thinking it was going to be one, two, three. It was going to be an easy victory. And it's been nothing of the sort. And the Russian economy is now in tatters. It's had a massive effect on the global economy. So nobody is coming to Putin's rescue. I think he severely underestimated what was going on. And it's funny, on a side note, last January, I made a New Year's resolution that I was going to listen to 100 audiobooks this year. And I'm still doing that. I'm on track to do it. And one of the books that I listened to just, 2 weeks ago was Sun Tzu's The Art of War.
Yeah, I've read that. It's
At,
excellent.
yeah, I've read it before, but I decided to listen to it again. And this time it was even more meaningful because as I'm listening to it, the thought popped into my head. Vladimir Putin has never read this book because it predicts Russia's ultimate demise because of the way he's running this war. And I think this is, he was looking to secure his legacy. He secured it all right, but it's a massively negative legacy, not what he was looking for.
Yeah, huge miscalculation. I agree. The only thing I would say, a little caveat, I'm not disagreeing with you at all. I believe that this hits, no pun intended, it hits home more than the Afghanistan war. Yes, it was Afghanistan would be more directly correlated to like the war in Vietnam. For us, it was way over there, out of sight, out of mind. This is right on Russia's border. The carnage is right there for everyone to see. Afghanistan, yeah, there was a full scale involvement, but again, out of sight, out of mind. I think it hits closer to home in Russia. I
Well, it
think it has
hits.
more domestic ramifications than even losing Afghanistan.
I think it hits closer to home for the Russians because
Yes.
for a long time, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. And that was Putin's justification was these are our brothers and they want to reunify with us. So we're going to bring them home. And it turns out nothing could have been further from the truth. Ukraine has no desire to reunify with Russia. I think it also hits the American people a lot harder than it did than Afghanistan
No
did
question.
because most of what went on in Afghanistan, the American people didn't know about it until afterwards. In terms of our own involvement here, it's on the news. We see it happening. We know we're supporting Ukraine. So it affects both Russia and the United States more. And I think that actually works in our favor because I think that involvement of the Russian people and the American people is what is keeping the Russian leadership and to a certain extent the Biden administration from escalating this further.
Let's certainly hope so. Um, Speaking of escalation, Trump has escalated, ramped up his game. He's made his announcement. Um, and not to the fanfare. I read a great article today about comparing what was it? Oh God, 6 years ago, whatever. Coming down the escalator with how it was how it played out in the press. Some calling him a clown, others thinking, "Wow, this is totally amazing." From what I'm gathering, and I think our listeners would love your opinion on this. I think I talk about miscalculations. I believe that it's fallen a lot flatter than he thought it would, especially coupled with the midterm performance, his selections of some, let's just say, less than stellar candidates who flamed out.
Yeah, I certainly think the reception was not what
He
Trump
thought.
expected.
Let me just interject one thing. This is really important. I love your opinions. Does it change anything in his own mind, or is he oblivious?
I don't think it changes anything in his own mind. He's never been one to be able to get out of the way of his own ego. But there were certain things that came out in this announcement. I mean, first of all, the the tone of the announcement very different from coming down the gold escalator at Trump Tower. Some people actually said this was much more presidential, and they're speculating that he realizes if he makes the election about him, he loses. So I think for him, this is more about his legacy, which is never a good thing for a presidential candidate. We saw Barack Obama use that when he was campaigning for Clinton, and
Because
we
no
also,
one cares about you. They care
right.
about what they've already gone through, the shit, excuse my language, that he's put America through. His policies, we've talked about this a billion times. He would have a great policy at 10 a.m. in the morning, and he'd screw it up by 12. And I think I know a lot of conservative friends. I have liberal friends as well. Everyone, it's not, can't just be by chance. They speak. I have like two conservative friends that are still Trump, Trump, Trump. All the rest is please. I've had enough. No mas.
Yeah, that seems to be the overwhelming feel within the Republican Party, and not just the electorate. A number of Trump's financial backers who backed him in 2020, who backed him in 2016, have already said they will not be donating to a Trump campaign again. They're set on backing Ron DeSantis. There have been several polls that have come out showing DeSantis in key primary states is beating Trump by double
Yes,
digits.
in fact, to that point, he's leading in New Hampshire, Iowa, Georgia, and obviously Florida, but not by 1%, by two. We talked about this on Carnivore Radio, I don't know, a couple months ago, or at least a month ago, that, and I'd love your comment on this, we already concluded that, and I think this is true, it's a house of cards. People just need the excuse. Like if he loses the Iowa caucus or New Hampshire, I believe it's game over. I think it falls like a house of cards. People just need a
I
reason to say he's not inevitable. It's over, dude. And I'm sick of him, by the way, because
yeah,
again, quoting another political expert, basically said he's the only Republican at this point of the whole beautiful field out there because they have great young candidates for potential young candidates. He's the only one that can lose, especially against our weekend at Bernie's and the Valley Girl.
yeah, I think most of the party has said, all right, you know what? Trump is now dragging down the party and they're not going to support him. But what was really noteworthy with his announcement was the fact that many of his family members that served in the cabinet were not there. His Melania, his daughter, has stated she will not be part of the Trump campaign. She will not be part of an administration if he wins.
Why do you think that's the
So he,
case?
I think the family members did not realize the firestorm they were going to be at the center of. And Melania has stated point blank, it was very hard on her. It was very hard on her kids. And she wants to focus on her family and focus on her kids now. And the thing
Interesting.
is, it's not circumstance that made it that firestorm. Trump could have done things differently and avoided a lot of what went on. But he always acted with a knee jerk reaction. The Democrats went after him and he shot back. Instead of going, oh, well, look how desperate the Democrats are. They're making these things up. Here are the facts. He could never do that. He could never
You
control
know,
his
your point is
temper.
no. Your point is the point, Doctor Lopkin. Instead of being measured, confident, not emotional, exactly, and that's what boggles my mind, Doctor Lopkin. Obviously, you're a really smart guy, but you're not, geopolitical, phenom that's on the nightly news every. You should be, but you're not. My point is, he's supposed to be Mr. Media. You know, he's been in the media since he's been 30 years old, and it's just kind of common sense. He created the instead of being measured and having a response with the facts, he'd tweet about a fat waitress and this guy's a pig or a moron, and it was like just ridiculous. And let me just say one other thing. I think what worked in 2016 will not work again. The little Marco crap, sanctimonious DeSantis. It's like that train has left the station.
No, it's not going to work again. And I think honestly, what happened is during the 2016 campaign, he basically played the same character that he does on The Apprentice. It was the reality show candidate, and people lapped it up. They went, oh, this is great. There was a lot of backlash against the Obama administration's policies. So when the Trump administration did put forward policies, he had some very solid policies, not
No
all
doubt.
of them, but
Some, most, yes.
and people were enjoying the show in 2016. And he saw that, so he ramped it up. But his big mistake was not ending the show when he took
A
office.
hundred
And
percent.
he kept that show going. And, it's like, when a TV show runs too long, it jumps the shark. People start turning off, and that's what happened. It's like, all right, you know what? It's no longer amusing. Now you're not a candidate anymore. Now you're the president.
Well, interesting about that, we talked about the night of the long knives that was going to happen if there was a red wave. I think the night of the long knives has come out not in total, but in part by the dismal midterm performance. And basically, essentially, you could say that Trump cost the Republicans the Senate by not only his presence, but his picking of some really crappy candidates not just for Senate, but let's say in Pennsylvania, the gubernatorial race, he picks like a total nutcase that dragged down the ticket. And, Dr. Oz was not a great candidate to begin with, just
No.
put fuel on the fire. So I think the midterms, just like we were talking about Iowa or New Hampshire, gives people the excuse. I think that was the first major shot, not a minor shot across the bow. And you even have now people coming out like Christie, ex-governor of New Jersey, basically going crazy times over. It's time to move on. And then Pence wrote a book, and Pence is a figure that is permanently damaged by his association with Trump. He was a loyal soldier for Trump,
Yes.
did everything that Trump required, actually stopped the bleeding, if our listeners remember, during after Trump's horrific first debate with Weekend at Bernie's, and he stopped the bleeding, and then to be betrayed, I'm sorry, reflects very negatively on Trump.
It does. And you're seeing more and more people separate from him. So, yes, Trump is not the inevitable candidate. And in fact, I think he's going to have an uphill battle because people don't want the sideshow anymore. And Biden actually, I think, did his part because let's face it. Biden came in saying he was going to unite the country, and everything he has done has divided the country more. Well, you saw in the midterm elections, moderates in both the Democrat and the Republican Party and independents are tired of this. They want the country united, and nobody thinks Trump can do that. So you have a large part of the Republican Party and the electorate as a whole going, no, this is not going to happen. We have to move on.
Also, time does play is a factor in almost everything. I thought Trump's marketing and branding reflected. I'm talking in 2016 during the campaign, really good marketing strategies. Basically realizing Americans' attention spans are limited, and the whole thing about branding, low energy Jed, little Marco, and all this Lion Ted. I I think it would backfire. People would say, "Oh God, not again." Your thoughts? Like a real strong backlash. Like I can't take it anymore. Just stop it. It's like
Well,
a temper tantrum.
you're already seeing that backlash when Trump went after DeSantis, sanctimonious
Yes.
DeSantis. And Ron DeSantis gave a speech. He acknowledged the name calling and he just said, when you're doing your job, when you're doing it well, people start coming after you. And quite frankly, DeSantis handled it the way it should have
Trump
been
should have.
handled.
Yes.
He was very presidential in his speech. He said, and he did take one shot at Trump when he said, let's take a look at the scorecard. Because DeSantis backed Republicans within Florida, and that was the only state that saw a red wave. The Republicans took Florida overwhelmingly,
Crushed
where
it. Man against boy. Yes.
yes, where the candidates that Trump backed did not do well. So you're seeing Trump does not have the coattails that he thought he did. His endorsements did not mean, victory in the midterms. And let's be very clear here. This is not surprising because in the primaries, his candidates did very well because who
Playing
comes
to his
out in
base.
right, who comes out in the primaries? The party faithful. And in both sides, the Republicans and the Democrats, the folks that come out tend to be more extreme. They come out to the radical right comes out in the Republican primaries, the radical left comes out in the Democratic primaries. but they're the minority when it comes to the general election because that's where the moderates come out. And more importantly, that's where the independents are voting. Remember, in most states, independents can't vote in primaries. So you don't see how they're leaning until election day.
I agree 100% with that. And not to belabor a point, but I certainly think the midterms would have, if the midterms turned out differently, I think again, it gave, I think the midterms a poor performance and Trump directly responsible for the poor performance, not in total, but in large measure, I think was the first fracture that we were talking about for months, giving the party faithful and others and even potential candidates the excuse to say we need to move on. And I think Trump, with his ego, is probably going to be very shocked at the increasingly cold reception he receives. That is my prediction.
I think you're right. And we will see even before primaries, because the first early indicator of how all of this is going to shake out is whether or not Mitch McConnell keeps the leadership within the Senate. Because you've got Trump is not a McConnell fan. Rick
No,
Scott, who's on the more extreme side, has already said he intends to challenge McConnell for leadership of the party within the Senate. If McConnell can hold on, it shows that the moderates are taking control of the party and the extremists are going to fall by the wayside.
great
Uh,
analysis, and I think that would be a great thing to happen. I'm not a Mitch McConnell fan, but I think we need some cleansing in the party because this, like Christie said, crazy time has to come to a close.
Absolutely. And Rick Scott is quite possibly the worst possible person to take over the leadership of the Republican Party within the Senate because most of the Democrats' attack points
We're
in
directly
their ads,
responsible to his platform.
yes, came from Rick Scott's platform, despite the fact that no other Republican ever signed on to it. And in fact, most said that's ridiculous. We're never going to do that. He provided the attack points for the Democrats.
I think
So,
your point is excellent. No question. I think the two biggest losers, who times we love to call winners and losers, was Rick Scott and Donald Trump. Do you agree?
yes, absolutely.
There's another loser, possibly, that I'd like your opinion on. I'm sure our listeners would do as well. Maloney, who lost his congressional seat in New York to it was flipped by a Republican, is blamed not just once, but is increasingly just adamantly blaming AOC and the crazies in the Democratic Party for his losses and others in the state of New York. Is AOC potentially becoming a, if you will, biggest loser?
I think AOC is increasingly becoming a liability to the Democratic Party, the squad as a whole. And in fact, though, in the midterms, the squad picked up two new members.
Oh
All
God,
of
no.
all of the squad members were reelected. They picked up two more. So they're feeling emboldened, but they really shouldn't because there was a great op-ed piece in the New York Times that outlined the parallels between Donald Trump and AOC. And AOC was highly offended by this piece, but the piece was spot on. The fact of the matter is, if Donald Trump does not do well in the primaries, you're going to see more and more Democrats pulling away from AOC in the squad and the progressive wackos because they have become the anti-Trump. Well, if you don't have Trump, you don't need an anti-Trump.
That is great analysis. 100%. They actually feed on Trump.
Yes.
Their
Now,
energy comes from Trump.
in terms of Maloney, I mean, this was a historic election for the Republicans because this was knocking out the head of the Democratic campaign committee in deep blue New York.
The
And
one who
yes,
told everyone to eat Chef Boyardee.
right. And
Genius.
to a certain extent, yes, the squad was responsible for this because it was progressive policies that people in New York voted against. And while there was a lot of attention paid on the fact that Lee Zeldin lost the gubernatorial race, the Republicans actually picked up congressional seats
Oh, he
in New
saved the
York.
Congress for the Republicans, Lee Zeldin.
Yes. So they turned several deep blue seats red because they were voting against progressive policies. And these were people who saw the damage the progressive policies had done. So, yes, were the progressives responsible for his loss? Yes, they had a hand in it. Was it because of what he was saying? No. He was blaming them for not campaigning for him, for not contributing to the general fund of the Democratic congressional campaigns. That's not why he lost. And that's not why they're to blame. They're to blame because of their horrific policies. And people are starting to vote against it when they're the ones being affected by it.
So overall, considering both parties, maybe we're coming out of the dark ages from the political landscape in America over the last 10 years, and maybe we're getting to, again, like Christy said, maybe crazy times over.
Hopefully, because both parties have been overtaken by the
The
insanity.
nutcases, yes.
And it is absolutely time that they go, you know what? We have to stop this. Yeah, Donald Trump attacking other Republicans as rhinos, you're Republicans in name only. It's like, no, both parties need to be inclusive, and that means accepting conservatives in the Republican Party, moderates, and liberals in the Republican Party. It means accepting conservatives in the Democratic Party and moderates and liberals. You have to be able to say, yes, we represent America. And the
Exactly,
de-
or else you become marginalized.
Yes, and the Democrats are going to have a harder time with this than the Republicans will, because you saw, with the exception of some of the Trump backed candidates, you saw many more African Americans running for office within the Republican Party. You saw many more women running for office within the Republican Party. You saw Hispanics swinging to the Republican Party. What
And I
kept
think
the
that's going to
Republican
have a lot of repercussions, obviously, as we move forward. Because when you really look at it, forget about what they say; it's what they do. The Republicans are becoming the party of diversity. The Democrats are a bunch of old white people.
Yeah, they're the old college boys club. Now, I mean, yes, they've become a boys and girls club, but let's if you take a good look, the Democrats lost not through elections, but through women who had won seats in 2016, 2018, 2020, saying, you know what? We don't want to run anymore. We don't want to be part of this shit show.
Yeah, agreed. Very interesting. On this, our last bit on the political landscape, it looks like Manchin, who we gave a little award to, not literally but figuratively, which we promptly took it back, now has a challenger. Do you think he might go down in what he created? I think when you look at West Virginia, it's not out of the question. He's the one who gave life to Biden.
Yeah, West
He
Virginia
was the respirator.
does tend to swing conservative, especially where energy is concerned. And Manchin was played by the Democrats when he agreed to vote for, they called the Inflation Reduction Act. It wasn't an Inflation Reduction Act. It was the Green New Deal that they rebranded. And Chuck Schumer said, we've got your back. We are going to push through what West Virginia needs. And the progressives in the House went, we didn't agree to that. We're not letting anything of the sort go through. So the fact that Manchin was played West Virginia is going, well, you know what? Maybe we need somebody else in office. Honestly, I think even though the Democrats held the Senate, I think Manchin and Sinema could gather up enough votes within the Senate to say, okay, you know what? We'll work with the Republicans on this. The Republicans have the House, and we will push through what Manchin was promised, which is more spending on, it's against Biden. Now, I don't know if they'll be able to get enough votes to actually convince Biden to sign it, but that would go a long way to saving his career. And the fact of the matter is, in the final days of the campaign, Biden doubled down that there will be no new drilling, that they are going to shut down coal plants. And Manchin stood up to him at the end of the campaign, but he didn't stand up to them when it came time for voting.
Agreed. It
And
was a
West
too little, too late.
Yeah,
And if
and
I
West
was a West,
Virginia is going to remember that.
I would agree 100%. Now, closing out on a good note, I'm a big fan of astronomy and space travel. We looks like our efforts or our initiatives in going back to the moon finally, Dr. Lockton, seem like they're bearing fruit.
Yes, the Artemis 1 launch actually successfully took off today. This is an unmanned rocket with crew cabin. They have mannequins in the crew cabin, so with monitors on them so they can uh, get data to see how actual people will react in the cabin. It is going to go to the moon, orbit the moon, circle, and return. The data will be used to work on Artemis 2, which will be a manned flight following the same trajectory. It'll circle the moon and come back. And pending the results of that, they're looking at Artemis 3 by 2030 of returning Americans to the moon. And it is way overdue. This
I
is
love what you
something.
said about way overdue because I am an astronomy fan and I'm a fan of space travel and I'm interested in that. I believe, well, it's my assertion that we wasted a lot of money and a lot of effort on the space shuttle, which was positioned as a low cost alternative for positioning satellites. It was actually the costliest. It proved very inefficient. We could have been focused that time in building stations, space stations on the moon, and very exciting things could have been happening. But we screwed around for 30 some odd years, going in suborbit and launching satellites that could have been launched for a third of the price with a regular rocket. I think the reason why this shuttle was even approved was behind the scenes. It was basically a military. Um, it had the potential for military implications.
Yeah, I think this is a huge step forward, and honestly, it actually shows that the government is no longer in a leadership position, because this would never have happened. NASA would never have done this if Elon Musk and SpaceX weren't talking about going to the moon, if Jeff Bezos and his rocket company weren't talking about going to the moon, and the private sector stepped up and went, look, if you're not going to do this, we will.
Are we in a second space race potentially that NASA is now concerned with their own livelihoods? If they don't beat private companies like Bezos and Elon Musk, could it be game over? You're
Well,
inefficient. You've taken years to do things. You took us 8 years to get to the moon in the '60s. We've been talking about the moon for 30 years.
it is a space race, but it's not NASA versus, SpaceX. Or what it is it's the old school companies like Boeing who stand to lose the most, because SpaceX can come in and do this for cheaper. It is a space race because now we have China talking about getting to the moon. And that is just as severe as it would have been in the 60s had the Russians beaten us to the moon. The moon is strategically important. And the last thing we want is China being able to build missile launchers on the moon with us not being able to get there on a regular basis and rein them in.
Problematic to say the least. Hopefully, this will be a good chapter moving forward for NASA, which I think has had a less than stellar performance over the last 30 years. Again, another space shuttle launch. Okay, great. I'm like, wow, I'm so excited about that. And then going to Mars for the 10th time, doing the same thing over and over again is getting to be, quite frankly, boring. But I think that's good that we're at least getting a little high note as we approach the moon, as we end this edition of Carnivore Radio. If listeners would like to give their input, they can do that, can't they, Dr. Lopkin?
Yes, they can. We'd love to hear from you. If there's a topic you want us to look into or just want to express your opinion on what we've said, you can go to xvadio.com/connect. Let us know what you're thinking. And of course, you can catch every episode of Carnivore Radio at the Carnivore Radio website, xvadio.com/podcasts, the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Audible, Amazon Music, and other platforms that respect freedom of speech.
Thank you, Dr. Lopkin, and thank our listeners.
We'll see you next time.